Hey, this is Ish, and in today's talk, I'm going to be going over the differences between learning from one teacher compared to multiple teachers. And specifically, I'll be going over the pros and cons to both. So the great thing about today's day and age is that we have information at our fingertips. We can just go on Google and just type in whatever, and we'll find the answers that we're looking for, compared to before, where we actually had to be very selective and search out the things that we wanted to. And in the past, when learning from teachers, typically what would happen is that you would study under a specific teacher for many years on end, even decades. And what I see nowadays is that, especially in the spiritual community, rather than study under one specific teacher in more of like an apprenticeship model, nowadays they have more of a flexible and loose kind of approach when starting under a teacher, and they entertain a lot of different viewpoints at the same time. And there are, again, pros and cons to both. So one great thing about learning from multiple teachers or multiple perspectives and viewpoints is that you're able to take the best information and discard all the rest that doesn't serve you and your purposes. So you can be very selective about what you want to learn. And one downside that does come with that, though, is that your learning tends to be a bit more superficial, because typically what happened in the past is that when you were trying to learn something, you'd learn everything, and you take even the bad parts or things that you may not like. But the plus with that type of approach, when you're studying under one lineage or one teacher, is that you're able to go very deep in your knowledge about a certain topic. On the flip side, when you're learning from multiple different sources, you're able to take what serves you and discard all the rest. But at the same time, you're not having a full understanding of one particular subject, so you're more of a generalist. And that does have some benefits. So for example, I do make a lot of different talks about spirituality, law of attraction, MBTI. So there's different aspects, and what I've done personally is I've taken different things, input from different teachers, and I kind of just molded it in together. But if you were to ask me specifically in the MBTI about going very deep into Jungian psychology, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you as much as other content creators, but I would be able to give you a very good understanding and bring that knowledge from other sources into it. So it's kind of like my own unique spin. So that's my kind of take on it. So I'll just give you some personal examples of some of the teachers that I follow and how I was able to take what I personally liked about them and then discard all the rest. So I'll give you a good example and also a controversial one, and that is the teacher Osho. So Osho was a mystic that really came into popularity in I think the 70s and 80s, and he kind of was part of that counterculture kind of movement, but he taught a lot of mysticism and mystic teachings. And one great thing you can learn from Osho specifically is the amount of freedom that is embodied in his being. And I'm also going to make another talk on Osho, but specifically you can tell by watching any kind of interview with him that he's completely relaxed. There's a gleam in his eye. He's not constrained by anything. And you can learn a lot about freedom through watching his body language, his expressions, and actually learning from his teachings specifically. You can also learn about mysticism. From him, he's able to connect a lot of different topics about the earth, the world, human functioning. And if you've been following the MBTI content or are familiar with it, you'd know that Osho has a very high level of extroverted intuition, because if you do read his books or watch his content, he's able to take a lot of different ideas and combine them into something that's completely revolutionary and something you've never heard of, which is really great about his teachings. Now, those are the great parts. What are the bad parts? And as you know, he formed a little cult, and there's a great documentary about that as well. And he also has like a rebellious kind of nature, and you could kind of see that with the times. He came into prominence in the 70s, and he was kind of going against the norms. But he took that to an extreme where you can see that in his books. He was like, screw this religion or screw that religion, and you can kind of see that there's a small semblance of like ego attached to it, where he was against all kind of like institutions and organized religion, but it came from an extreme angle, so he's very like harsh in that aspect, and that's probably not a good thing you want to incorporate. And you could also tell that by his students, and that's a great way to see or really study teachers, to see how their students behave, is that his students also kind of adopted his same mannerisms, and people in the documentary would say that his students were almost like a carbon copy of Osho, just in the way that they looked around and behaved in society. And let's take another example of another teacher that I follow, and that's Eckhart Tolle. So he's pretty famous for his books Power of Now and The New Earth, and he was featured on Oprah and does a lot of talk shows. And his teachings are really great because they're very practical and gives you good reminders. Because if you follow Osho, for example, mysticism by its nature tends to have a lot of flowery language and allows you to really uncover things at your own pace and kind of like demystify things. Whereas Eckhart Tolle's teachings is very practical and straightforward. He doesn't use a lot of fluff. He just says like, you kind of do this and do that. And that's actually why his books are a lot more popular than a lot of other spiritual teachers, is the reason because they're so easy to understand and access. That's why, when I first read that book when I was like 15 or so, I was able to read through it and I understood it. It made sense. Well, what are some limitations? Well, the limitations are, like I mentioned, his teachings are really good for beginners, but there does come a point where you need more depth. And Eckhart Tolle doesn't really provide that. And actually, if you go further, you'll notice that he came about his enlightenment experience not through practice, but rather through just like a sudden awakening. So the story kind of went that he just had all of a sudden like a spiritual awakening, and then he's now teaching about how to access that. But it wasn't backed by like decades of meditation practice and like sitting in zendos and all that. So his teachings don't have a certain quality of depth and doesn't come from backing. So he's not like an expert in his field, so to speak. So that's one limitation where if you're getting new to spirituality, like he'd be a great start. But if you do want to go deeper and you have like specific questions and specific hurdles, then it'd be better to look for other teachers like maybe Shinzen Young or other ones as well. And what I personally also find very interesting, as I've now started to study under certain like teachers in person, is that when you spend time around a teacher, you tend to adopt their personality, their little quirks here and there, and their overall lifestyle. So this is why, if you are looking to kind of go down a path where you're looking to just study under one teacher, it's important you consider the full implications of that, because you'll unconsciously tend to adopt the mannerisms of whoever you're speaking with. So make sure it's kind of coming from a good place. And just some like macro level perspectives, and I'm just talking about spirituality here in this talk, but you can obviously apply what I'm saying to really any subject. So if we're talking about spirituality, let's just say you're studying under the Zen tradition. Well, one thing you'll notice about a lot of Zen masters is that they have an air of very like calmness and very chill. But what you'll also notice is that a lot of them sometimes are very uptight and strict. And this is because there's a lot of rules in place in Zen, a lot of customs. And you'll also notice that just from the culture, they tend to be a bit more like stiff. Whereas if you look at yoga, what the Hatha yoga and like those traditions is like, what's great about that is that the yogis are very expressive, they're very blissful. And you take Kundalini, for example, you're like pushing like prana up the body and you're very energized. And those are great states to have. But one drawback is that if you continue down a certain path like that, like nonstop, is that a lot of yogis tend to be very reactive. And that's something that they can learn from Zen masters about, because they're very non-reactive. So it's kind of like pros and cons to both. And if you were to take a multiple teacher approach, you can take the good parts of Zen and kind of like take that like calmness, but then also take the expressiveness in yoga and combine that. So you can take both. But then again, this is a totally personal decision. So if you do want, let's just say you're naturally a bit more like uptight naturally, and you don't want more of that, then maybe going down a yoga path all the way is the right path for you. So only you can really decide which to choose, whether you want to take in multiple inputs or just go through one. And some other things I've just noticed is that if you do tend to take a viewpoint of understanding different perspectives, this tends to expand your mind. And that's very awesome to have, because you have that breadth of experience where you can take on different things. But one pro to studying under one teacher specifically is that you have very deep knowledge. And this is because you take everything in and just go in all the way. So it's really up to you as far as whether you want to take in more viewpoints to have an overall understanding of different things. It depends on your field, or whether you want to take in a more deeper understanding of certain things. So it really just depends on like your personality and what you're focusing on. So if you're focusing on fields that require a lot of mastery and expertness and like depth, like chess or golf, this is where it's better to study under one teacher and go all the way. But if you're doing something like creativity, like arts, music, it'll actually be more beneficial for you to study under multiple teachers or get multiple viewpoints. And in this way, you have a better understanding, and they can actually combine all those things to create something greater. So anyways, a little rant here. Hope this helps, and let me know if you have any future suggestions for talks. Thank you.